Before we descend into the shadows of the intelligence world, into the classified files that were never meant to see the light of day, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. We are uncovering the operations that governments deny, and you won't want to miss what comes next. In the blistering heat of the Damascus summer of 1982, General Nabil al-Fayed was a man who believed himself to be untouchable. He was not merely a military officer, he was an institution. As the chief of logistics for the Syrian army's most sensitive division, al-Fayed held the keys to the kingdom. He knew where the chemical reserves were buried, he knew the patrol routes of the elite Republican Guard, and he knew the precise locations of the Soviet-made radar installations that scanned the skies for Israeli phantoms. He was a man of heavy stature, with a mustache that was groomed with the same precision he applied to his supply lines. He moved through the souks and the salons of the Syrian capital with an air of regal indifference, surrounded by a phalanx of bodyguards who looked at everyone not in uniform as a potential threat. But al-Fayed had a weakness, one that the analysts in Tel Aviv had identified after months of sifting through the noise of signal intercepts and human intelligence reports. The general was bored. He was a man of action stuck in a role of administration. He craved the thrill of the field, the adrenaline of the front lines that he had known in his youth. The bureaucracy of Damascus, with its endless paperwork and political maneuvering, was slowly suffocating him. He sought escape in long, solitary drives to the inspection posts near the Lebanese border, ostensibly to check on readiness, but in reality, to feel the wind in his face and the illusion of freedom. The decision to target al-Fayed did not come from a desire to eliminate him. A dead general is replaced within a week, often by someone more cautious and less prone to the errors of arrogance. No, the decision-makers at the Institute, the colloquial name for Mossad, wanted him alive. They didn't want a martyr, they wanted a library. Al-Fayed was a walking encyclopedia of Syrian strategic capabilities. If he could be made to talk, or if his disappearance could be engineered to look like a defection, the psychological blow to the regime would be catastrophic. The operation was given the green light under the codename Sandstorm. It was to be a clean extraction. No noise, no witnesses, and absolutely no trail. The team assembled for Sandstorm was drawn from the shadows of the Caesarea unit. They were men and women who lived their lives in the gray zones, fluent in Arabic, comfortable in the hostile streets of enemy capitals, and trained to be invisible. The lead operative, a man known only as Eitan, had spent the last 6 months living in Damascus under the cover of a Lebanese import-export businessman. He had frequented the same cafes as the general's lower-level aides, slowly building a picture of the man's routine. Eitan knew that every Thursday evening, the general dismissed his heavy security detail at the outskirts of the city before driving his vintage Mercedes to a private villa near the border for a night of cards and whiskey. That 30-minute window on the lonely stretch of highway was the only vulnerability in al-Fayed's armor. But in the world of intelligence, a plan is only as good as the chaos it can endure. As the team moved into position in late August, the political climate was shifting. The war in Lebanon was winding down, but the tensions were higher than ever. The Syrians were paranoid, expecting Israeli tricks at every turn. Al-Fayed had become more erratic, his drives faster, his temper shorter. The window of opportunity was closing. The order came down from Tel Aviv. Take him now, or abort the mission entirely. Eitan looked at the dusty road map spread out on the table of his safe-house apartment. He traced the route of the Mercedes. It was a go. Surveillance is an art form that requires a patience that borders on the monastic. For the operatives of the surveillance unit, known as the Yahalom, tracking General al-Fayed was an exercise in tedium, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. They had to be close enough to see the color of his tie, but far enough away to remain nothing more than background noise in the bustling chaos of Damascus. They used a rotating cast of vehicles, battered taxis, delivery trucks, private sedans, to trail him. They mapped his life down to the minute. They knew he preferred strong Turkish coffee at 10 a.m., that he suffered from mild sciatica, which made him walk with a slight limp on rainy days, and that he had a mistress in the Christian quarter whom he visited every Tuesday. This pattern of life analysis was critical. It allowed the team to predict his movements before he even made them. but it also revealed the man behind the uniform. Al-Fayed was lonely. Despite his power and his entourage, he was isolated by his rank. He spoke to his driver with more warmth than he did his fellow generals. This psychological profile was forwarded to the psychologists in Tel Aviv. They built a profile of a man who felt underappreciated, a man who believed his genius was being wasted on logistics while lesser men took the glory of command. This was the leverage they would eventually need. If they could capture him, they wouldn't break him with pain. They would break him with the truth of his own insignificance to the regime he served. The surveillance team noticed a change in the routine on the first Thursday of September. The general stopped at a roadside shrine on his way to the villa. He stayed there for 20 minutes, smoking a cigarette and staring at the horizon. Eitan, watching through high-powered optics from a ridge a kilometer away, felt a chill. Was the general meeting someone? Was this a dead drop? Or was it just a moment of introspection? The uncertainty was dangerous. If Al-Fayed was running his own counterintelligence operations, the abduction team could be walking into a trap. Eitan radioed the observation back to headquarters. The analysis came back within the hour. Proceed with caution. No signs of counter-surveillance detected. The subject appears to be under high personal stress. The stress was understandable. Rumors were circulating in Damascus of a purge within the Ba'ath Party. Officers were disappearing in the night. Al-Fayed likely feared he was next. This paranoia worked in Mossad's favor. If he disappeared, the regime would assume he had fled or had been taken by a rival faction. They wouldn't immediately suspect an Israeli operation. Confusion was the operative's best friend. The night of the operation arrived with a heavy cloud cover, obscuring the moon. It was perfect. The team set up a false checkpoint on the lonely road leading to the villa. They wore the uniforms of the Syrian military police, uniforms that had been stitched in a basement in Tel Aviv based on the latest intelligence photographs. They had a jeep with Syrian markings, complete with the correct dirt and dents. It was theater, but the stakes were life and death. If Al-Fayed's bodyguards decided to accompany him this time, if a real patrol came by, or if the general simply decided to turn around, the operation would be blown. Eitan stood by the side of the road, the collar of his uniform turned up against the wind. He checked his watch. The Mercedes was due in 4 minutes. He signaled to the team. The road spikes were laid out, hidden in the dust. The military police adjusted their berets. They weren't going to shoot unless absolutely necessary. The goal was a clean snatch. The silence of the desert was heavy, amplified by the buzzing of the insects. Then, in the distance, the twin beams of headlights cut through the darkness. The target was approaching. The headlights grew larger, sweeping across the scrub brush and the rocks. The vintage Mercedes was moving fast, too fast for the road conditions. Al-Fayed was driving aggressively, as was his habit on these nights. Eitan stepped into the road, raising a red lantern, waving it in a slow, authoritative arc. The other operatives stood by the jeep, weapons slung casually but ready, projecting an air of bored routine. This was the key to the deception: make it look mundane. A checkpoint was an annoyance, not a threat. The Mercedes slowed, the tires crunching on the gravel. The general did not stop immediately. He rolled the window down, shouting something in Arabic, his voice thick with irritation. "Do you know who I am?" he bellowed. "Get out of my way, you idiots!" Eitan approached the driver's side, keeping his face in the shadow of his cap. He saluted, a sharp, practiced motion. "Apologies, General," Eitan said in flawless Syrian dialect. "Section Command ordered a security sweep. Reports of smugglers in the area. We need to see your identification, just for the log." Al-Fayed was furious. "Smugglers? I am General Al-Fayed. I will have your commander stripped of his rank." But he stopped the car. The engine idled, a low purr in the quiet night. He reached into his jacket pocket, presumably for his ID. This was the moment. As the general's hand moved, Eitan gave the signal, a simple tap on the roof of the car. 2 operatives emerged from the darkness on the passenger side and the rear. The doors were wrenched open before the general could react. It wasn't a fight. It was a swarm. Al-Fayed was a large man, but he was older, and the operatives were in their prime. He was pulled from the car, a hood thrown over his head, and a sedative injected into his neck before his boots even dragged in the dust. There was no shouting, no gunfire, just the scuffle of boots and the heavy breathing of men working fast. The general went limp within seconds. They tossed him into the back of the jeep, covering him with a tarp and crates of supplies. The Mercedes was the loose end. One of the operatives, a specialist in mechanics, jumped into the driver's seat. He would drive the car another 20 kilometers south, to a ravine known for accidents. They would stage a crash, making it look like the general had lost control on a sharp turn. The car would burn. By the time the wreckage was found, the forensic evidence would be compromised by the fire. The regime would mourn a tragic accident, or perhaps suspect a rival's sabotage, but they wouldn't look for him in Israel. Eaton jumped into the passenger seat of the jeep. "Go," he ordered. The vehicle tore away from the fake checkpoint, leaving nothing but tire tracks that the wind would erase by morning. They had the package. Now came the hardest part: the crossing. They were 50 kilometers from the extraction point, traversing territory that was crawling with Syrian patrols and Bedouin scouts. The general snored softly in the back, a sleeping giant who had no idea that his life as Nabil al-Fayed was over. He was now just cargo. The journey to the border was a navigation of silence. The jeep ran without lights, the driver using night vision goggles that were technology decades ahead of what the Syrians possessed. They moved through wadis and dried riverbeds, avoiding the main roads. Every shadow looked like a tank. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a patrol. The tension in the vehicle was a physical weight. They were carrying one of the most wanted men in the Middle East, and if they were caught, there would be no diplomatic immunity, no prisoner exchange. They would disappear into the dungeons of Damascus, never to be heard from again. Al-Fayed stirred once, groaning under the tarp. The medic in the back administered a second, smaller dose of the sedative. "Keep him under," Aitan whispered. "We can't have him waking up and making noise." They reached the extraction point at 03 hours. It was a desolate stretch of the Golan Heights, a place of basalt rocks and old minefields. A gap in the fence had been prepared by a combat engineering unit earlier that night. Waiting for them on the Israeli side was a different vehicle, an unmarked van with tinted windows. The transfer was quick. The Syrian general was lifted from the jeep and placed onto a stretcher in the van. The operatives stripped off their Syrian uniforms, burying them in a pre-dug pit along with the false plates of the jeep. The jeep itself was left there, rigged with a timed incendiary device that would reduce it to a husk of unrecognizable metal in 10 minutes. As the van moved away, climbing the steep roads toward the secure facility, Aitan finally exhaled. They were in Israeli-controlled territory. The immediate danger was over, but the operational complexity was just beginning. Al-Fayed was now a guest of the state. He officially did not exist. There would be no Red Cross visits, no trial, no record of his entry. He was a ghost. The van drove for hours, heading south. They bypassed the major cities, sticking to the desert highways. As the sun began to rise, illuminating the stark beauty of the Negev desert, the landscape changed. It became harsher, emptier. This was where the state kept its deepest secrets. They arrived at a facility that looked like nothing more than a water pumping station from the air. But underground, it was a high-tech interrogation center. This was to be Al-Fayed's new home. When the general finally woke up, he was in a white room. There were no windows. The light was artificial and constant. He was wearing a gray jumpsuit. His mustache had been shaved off while he slept, a psychological tactic designed to strip him of his identity and dignity. He touched his upper lip, confused, his mind foggy from the drugs. He stood up, his legs shaking, and banged on the heavy steel door. "I am General Al-Fayed," he screamed, his voice cracking. "I demand to see my ambassador." The only answer was the buzzing of the air conditioning. He was alone. The silence was absolute. It was the first brick in the wall of isolation that they were building around him. The interrogation of General Al-Fayed was not what one might expect from the movies. There were no car batteries, no waterboarding, no physical violence. The men who ran the facility, Unit 504, knew that torture was inefficient. It produced lies, not intelligence. A man in pain will say anything to make it stop. Instead, they used the environment. The temperature in the room was kept slightly too cold. The lights never turned off, disrupting his circadian rhythm. The food was nutritious but bland, flavorless paste and lukewarm water. For the first week, no one spoke to him. Guards would enter to deliver food or escort him to the bathroom, wearing masks and ear protection. They never made eye contact. They never responded to his threats, his pleas, or his attempts at bribery. He was treated like furniture. This was the silent treatment, designed to make the subject desperate for human interaction. By the time the first interrogator entered the room on day 8, Al-Fayed was practically vibrating with the need to speak. The interrogator, a man who introduced himself simply as Captain Yossi, was polite, almost scholarly. He brought a pack of cigarettes, the general's favorite brand, and placed them on the table. "Good morning, Nabil," Yossi said, using his first name without the title. It was a calculated insult disguised as familiarity. "I hope you are resting well." "You are Israeli," Al-Fayed spat, though his eyes lingered on the cigarettes. "You have kidnapped a sovereign officer. This is an act of war." Yossi smiled sadly. "Nabil, there is no war. You died in a car accident last week. Your funeral was very moving. The president himself attended. Your wife cried beautifully." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos, fake, forged with expert precision, showing a burnt-out Mercedes and a funeral procession in Damascus with a closed casket. Al-Fayed stared at the photos. His hands trembled. "Lies," he whispered. "They know I am missing. They are looking for me." "They stopped looking 3 days ago," Yossi said softly. "To the world, you are dust. You only exist in this room, and the only way you leave this room, the only way you get to see the sun again, is if you help us understand some things about the logistics of the 4th Armored Division." The general pushed the folder away. He crossed his arms. "I will tell you nothing." But the seed of doubt had been planted. The isolation, the loss of identity, the proof of his death, it was all weighing on him. Yossi didn't press him. He stood up, left the cigarettes, and walked out. "Think about it, Nabil. You have a lot of time." Months passed. The dance between Yossi and Al-Fayed continued. The general was tough. His loyalty to the regime was forged in decades of indoctrination. He gave them crumbs, minor details about fuel consumption rates, the names of incompetent officers, things that were of low value. He was trying to play the game, to give enough to buy better treatment, but not enough to be a traitor. The intelligence analysts were frustrated. They knew he was holding back the crown jewels, the locations of the chemical stockpiles and the emergency mobilization protocols. The pressure from the top was mounting. "Get the information," the director ordered. "We didn't snatch him to hear about how much diesel a T-62 tank consumes." They tried different tactics. They brought in a bad cop, a loud, aggressive interrogator who shouted and flipped tables. They tried a fellow prisoner, a plant placed in the next cell who whispered about escape plans, trying to get Al-Fayed to confide in him. Al-Fayed saw through most of it. He was an intelligence officer himself, trained in counterinterrogation. He knew the playbook, but time was the one variable he couldn't control. His health began to deteriorate. He lost weight. The lack of sunlight made his skin pale and translucent. The isolation was eating at his mind. He began to have conversations with people who weren't there. He argued with his father. He pleaded with his wife. The microphones in the ceiling picked it all up. The psychologists analyzed his ramblings, looking for weaknesses. Then the geopolitical landscape shifted. A new crisis erupted in the region, a different war, different players. The intelligence Al-Fayed held, while still valuable, was no longer the ticking bomb it had been. The urgency faded. The resources for his interrogation were scaled back. Yossi visited less frequently. The food became even blander. Al-Fayed realized with horror that he was becoming irrelevant. The only thing worse than being tortured for secrets is being ignored because your secrets no longer matter. He tried to offer more, to trade real information for a book, for a better mattress, for a window. But the system was slow to react. He had been categorized as a low-yield asset. He was stuck in limbo, a ghost in a machine that had moved on to new targets. He sat in his cell, staring at the white walls, counting the seconds, realizing that his resistance had bought him nothing but oblivion. It had been 18 months since the abduction. The initial excitement of Operation Sandstorm had long since evaporated within the corridors of the Institute. General Al-Fayed was no longer the prize catch, he was a budget line item. The facility where he was held was needed for new, higher priority detainees coming in from the Northern Front. A decision had to be made. He couldn't be released. He knew too much about the facility itself, and his resurrection would be a diplomatic nightmare that Israel couldn't afford. He couldn't be killed. That violated the operational code of the time for non-combatant detainees. So the decision was made to transfer him. The order was stamped administrative retention. It was a bureaucratic euphemism for storage. Al-Fayed was hooded, shackled, and loaded into the back of a transport truck in the dead of night. He thought perhaps this was the end, that they were taking him to the desert to put a bullet in his head. Part of him welcomed it. Death would be a release from the White Room. But the truck didn't stop at a shallow grave. It drove for hours, deeper into the Negev, into the vast uninhabited emptiness of the Zin wilderness. They arrived at a location that didn't appear on any official map. It was a remnant of a bygone era, a small, fortified compound that had once been used for field testing experimental equipment in the 1960s. It consisted of a few perimeter fences, a water tower, and a small concrete structure that looked more like a bunker than a house. It was known simply as Site 4. There were no other prisoners here, just a rotating guard detail of 3 soldiers and a site commander, usually a reservist officer who wanted a quiet posting. Al-Fayed was placed in the main structure. It wasn't a cell in the traditional sense. It had a bed, a table, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom. There was a window, but it was barred and looked out only onto a high concrete wall. He could see a patch of sky, a brilliant, cruel blue during the day, and a tapestry of stars at night. "This is your home now," the commander told him. He was a tired-looking man who clearly didn't know who Al-Fayed was, only that he was a state prisoner who was to be kept alive and isolated. The transfer marked the beginning of the deep freeze. No more interrogations, no more mind games, just existence. Al-Fayed was left to rot. The file on him back at headquarters was archived, moved from the active desk to the cold storage cabinet. As commanders rotated out and new governments were elected, the institutional memory of who exactly was at Site 4 began to fade. He was becoming a shadow of a shadow. The structure at Site 4 was punishing. In the summer, the concrete absorbed the desert heat, turning the room into an oven. Al-Fayed would lie on the floor, stripped to his underwear, gasping for air, sweat pooling around him. In the winter, the desert nights were freezing. The cold seeped into his bones, waking up the old injuries from his military career. He shivered under thin wool blankets, his teeth chattering in the darkness. He aged rapidly. The robust general who had commanded divisions was gone. In his place was a gaunt, bearded figure with wild eyes and long, graying hair. He stopped grooming himself. What was the point? There was no one to impress. The guards were instructed not to speak to him beyond necessary commands. Food. Inspection. Step back. To occupy his mind, he began to hoard. He saved the plastic spoons from his meals. He collected the dead beetles that crawled into his room. He arranged them in complex formations on the floor, reenacting the great tank battles of the 1973 war. "The 7th Brigade moves here," he would mutter, pushing a beetle to the left. "We flank them here." He constructed a fantasy world where he was still in command. He gave speeches to the walls, lengthy tirades about Arab nationalism and strategic depth. He drafted imaginary letters to the president, detailing his escape plans and his loyalty. But there was no paper, no pen. He wrote with his finger in the dust that accumulated on the table. The guards watched him on the closed-circuit monitors. They thought he was mad. "Look at the crazy old man," they would joke. They didn't know he was a general. They didn't know he had once dined with prime ministers. To them, he was just the hermit. The dehumanization was complete. He wasn't a political prisoner anymore. He was a zoo animal in a concrete cage. One day, a sandstorm hit the facility. For 3 days, the wind howled like a banshee, sand blasting against the walls. The sky turned an apocalyptic orange. Al-Fayed sat by the window, watching the sand swirl. He felt a strange kinship with the storm. It was chaotic, violent and indifferent. Sandstorm, he whispered, remembering the operational name the interrogator had once mocked him with. I am the sand. Year 3. The human mind is resilient, but it requires inputs to function. Deprived of conversation, news, and sensory variety, Al-Fayed's memory began to fragment. He started to forget the faces of his children. He couldn't remember the sound of his wife's laugh. He struggled to recall the layout of Damascus. The past was dissolving, leaving him anchored only in the miserable present. He began to lose language. When he tried to speak to himself, the words came out garbled, a mix of Arabic, French, and the few Hebrew words he had picked up from the guards. He developed a stutter. He would stare at his hands for hours, fascinated by the wrinkles, the veins. Who are you? He would ask his own reflection in the polished metal mirror above the sink. The face staring back was a stranger. The guards changed every few months. The new rotations knew even less than the previous ones. The paperwork regarding the prisoner was sparse, just a number and a security clearance level. The site commander, a man named Doran, was lazy. He didn't bother to read the full file. He just wanted to finish his reserve duty and go back to his electronics shop in Tel Aviv. He cut corners. He stopped sending the detailed weekly reports on the prisoner's condition, replacing them with copy-pasted generic updates. Subject stable, no change. Back in Tel Aviv, the desk officer responsible for the special detainees section retired. His replacement, a young, ambitious woman named Sarah, was overwhelmed with the backlog of files. She saw the reports from Site 4, subject stable, and filed them away without reading. The system was running on autopilot. Al-Fayed was falling through the cracks of bureaucracy. He had a moment of clarity one night. He woke up from a dream where he was flying a kite on the beach in Latakia. He sat up, his heart pounding. I am Nabil, he said aloud, forcing the name out. I am Nabil Al-Fayed. He repeated it like a mantra, fighting against the erasure, but the silence of the desert swallowed his voice. He realized then that he wasn't going to die a general. He was going to die a nobody, buried in an unmarked grave in the sand, and the world would never know. Chapter 10. The Anomaly. It was purely by accident that the ghost of Site 4 was rediscovered. It was the 4th year of his confinement. A routine audit of the logistical supply chain for the Southern Command flagged an anomaly. A computerized system, newly installed to modernize the Army's inventory, detected a recurring shipment of food and medical supplies to a coordinate grid that was listed as decommissioned. The anomaly was flagged to a junior analyst in the logistics corps, a kid named Ari. Ari was diligent. He looked up the coordinates. Site 4. It was supposed to be empty. Why was it consuming enough water and food for a small squad and a single detainee? He thought it was a mistake, perhaps someone stealing supplies. He escalated the report to military intelligence. The report landed on the desk of a section chief in the Internal Security Department. He frowned. Site 4 wasn't under standard military jurisdiction. It was a black site leased to the Institute. He made a secure phone call. Do you guys still have an operation running at Grid 45 Alpha? The question triggered a search in the Institute's archives. Sarah, the desk officer, was tasked to investigate. She pulled the physical file, blowing the dust off the cover. She opened it and saw the photo of General Al-Fayed, taken the day he arrived. She looked at the date, 4 years ago. Her eyes widened. My God, she whispered. He's still there. There was panic in the office. Keeping a high-value target for 4 years without trial, without Red Cross access, and without active intelligence value was a legal and political time bomb. The operation had drifted into negligence. The general had been forgotten not out of malice, but out of bureaucratic inertia. A team was immediately dispatched to assess the situation. They weren't interrogators this time. They were inspectors. They drove out to the Negev in a convoy of SUVs. When they arrived at Site 4, the reservist commander was surprised. We didn't know you were coming, he stammered. Open the facility, the lead inspector ordered. They unlocked the heavy door of the bunker. The smell hit them first, stale air, unwashed body, and despair. They walked into the main room. Al-Fayed was sitting in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, rocking back and forth. He looked up, his eyes blinded by the sudden influx of people. He didn't look like a general. He looked like a castaway. Chapter 11. The Wreckage. The medical assessment was grim. General Al-Fayed was malnourished, suffering from severe vitamin D deficiency, muscle atrophy, and advanced cognitive decline. He could barely stand. He didn't understand who the people were. When a doctor tried to examine him, he recoiled, whimpering like a beaten dog. "He's barely recognizable," the doctor whispered to the team leader. "If we put him on TV like this, it's a war crime." The realization of what they had done settled over the team. This wasn't a masterful intelligence operation anymore. It was a humanitarian disaster. The general was useless as an asset. He couldn't provide intelligence. He barely knew what year it was. He was a liability. Sarah, who had accompanied the team, felt a wave of nausea. She looked at the man who had once been a powerful enemy. Now, he was just a broken old man. "What do we do with him?" she asked. The answer came from the highest levels. "Clean it up." They couldn't keep him, and they couldn't kill him. They had to return him, but they had to do it in a way that protected the state. He had to be nursed back to health, at least enough to travel. For the next 2 months, Site 4 was transformed into a rehabilitation center. Better food was brought in. Doctors treated his ailments. A barber shaved his beard and cut his hair. They tried to engage him in conversation, to bring him back to reality. It was a slow, painful process. Al-Fayed started to speak again, but his mind was fractured. He mixed the past and present. He thought the doctors were his staff officers. He never fully recovered. The spark was gone. The desert shack had taken his soul, but physically he was stable enough to be moved. The decision was made to dump him back into the Syrian sphere, but not directly. A quiet exchange was arranged through a third-party channel in Europe. A humanitarian release of a wandering, confused man found near the border. The cover story was thin, but the Syrians would accept it because the alternative, admitting they lost a general for 4 years, was too embarrassing. Chapter 12. The Long Walk Home. The drop-off was arranged in the Golan Heights, not far from where he had been abducted 4 years earlier. It was a misty morning, the fog clinging to the minefields. Al-Fayed was dressed in civilian clothes, a simple suit that hung loosely on his frame. He stood by the UN outpost, flanked by 2 men in plain clothes. He looked at the Syrian border. He didn't seem to recognize it. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice raspy. "You're going home, Nabil," one of the operatives said, not unkindly. A Syrian vehicle approached the gate on the other side. There were no flags, no ceremony. Just 2 intelligence officers from Damascus who looked at the frail man with suspicion and contempt. They didn't see a hero returning. They saw a problem. The gate opened. Al-Fayed was guided forward. He walked slowly, his limp pronounced. He crossed the line. The Israelis watched him go. There was no victory in this moment. No triumph. Just the closing of a file that should have been closed years ago. When the Syrian officers took him by the arms, he flinched. They shoved him into the back of their car. As they drove away, Al-Fayed looked back one last time. He saw the mist, the rocks, and the empty road. He didn't remember the shack, or the White Room, or the beetles. He just felt cold. The general returned to Damascus, but Nabil Al-Fayed had died in the desert. He lived out his remaining years in a quiet house arrest, kept away from the public eye, a senile old man who mumbled about sandstorms. The world never learned where he had been. The file in the institute was marked closed, and Site 4 was bulldozed into the sand, leaving no trace that a general had once lived there, forgotten by the world in a shack at the end of the earth. If you want to know more about the operations that stay in the dark, don't forget to like and subscribe.